Before the sun has even cleared the ridge, the valley is already breathing. Mist hangs in the canopy of a rainforest in the far south of India, so old and so dense that the light comes down green, filtered through layer upon layer of leaves long before it ever reaches the ground. Rain is almost always somewhere in the air here, dripping from the tips of enormous trees that have stood rooted on these slopes for centuries, on ground that has never been cleared, never been ploughed, never been opened to the sky. Orchids cling to the bark, ferns uncurl in the wet shade, insects that most people will never see, and some that science has still never named, move through the undergrowth, and high up in the branches, mostly unseen, a troop of one of the rarest large primates on Earth slips quietly from tree to tree. This place is called Silent Valley. And in the 1970s, officials looked at this living, breathing, irreplaceable forest, and they saw something else entirely. They saw a reservoir. A plan was drawn up to throw a dam across the river that threads through the valley and to flood a great part of it for hydroelectric power, sinking the forest and everything in it beneath a still, silent sheet of water. On paper, it made a certain kind of sense: power, progress, jobs for a poor state that badly needed them. And it very nearly happened. What stopped it was not a single government order and not one grand heroic gesture. It was a movement made of thousands of people who refused to let this forest go quietly. And among them, lending her voice near the very end of a long and extraordinary life, was a woman in her 80s who understood, better than almost anyone else alive, exactly what stood to be lost. I'm Harold Calder, and this is the story of Edevalath Kakat Janaki Amal, one of the most remarkable scientists India has ever produced, and of the ancient forest she refused to let disappear. But to understand why an 80-year-old botanist would spend some of her last strength on a valley most of her own countrymen had never even heard of, you have to go back to the beginning and understand why, to her, a forest was never simply a stand of trees. She was born in 1897 in the town of Tellicherry on the coast of Kerala, in the far southwest of India, into a large family, and into a community that the rigid caste order of the time treated as low. Her father kept a library in the family home and carried a real curiosity about the natural world, about birds and plants and the living things around him, and that curiosity passed to his daughter early. As a child among the coconut palms and the wet green of the Malabar coast, she grew up paying attention to living things in a way most people grow out of. The shape of a leaf, the habits of a bird, the quiet machinery of growth going on all around her. That attention never left her. But curiosity was not the problem. The problem was the path already drawn for a girl in her position. Educated a little, if at all, and married young, and that was meant to be the whole of a life. Janaki refused it. She would not marry. She would study instead, and her father, unusually for his time, let her. Understand what that refusal cost her and what it risked. In her world, a woman who would not marry and insisted on an education instead was not admired for it. She was treated as a problem, an oddity, someone stepping out of the place society had assigned her by both her sex and her caste. Every door she later walked through, she had to push open against the assumption that she did not belong on the other side of it. She took what education the missionary schools of the region could offer. She taught for a while, and then she did something almost no Indian woman of her generation did. She crossed an ocean to study science, winning a place at the University of Michigan in the United States, and in 1931 she became, by most accounts, the first woman ever to earn a doctorate in botany in America. Her research was on chromosomes, the tiny threads inside every living cell that carry the instructions for what a plant will become, and that patient, invisible work, counting and comparing structures almost no one else was looking at, would define the rest of her life. When she came back to India with that doctorate, she was pulled into a problem her country genuinely needed solved. India, in the 1930s, grew a great deal of sugarcane, but not the sweetest kind, and it leaned on expensive imports to make up the difference. spending money a poor nation could ill afford on somebody else's harvest. So, at a breeding institute in the southern city of Coimbatore, Janaki Amal turned her knowledge of chromosomes on the sugarcane plant itself. She understood, as few then did, how those threads behaved when you crossed one plant with another, and she used that understanding to attempt crosses nobody had dared, breeding sugarcane not only with its own relatives but with entirely different grasses, and in one experiment even with bamboo, something that had simply never been done before. Out of that work came hardier, higher-yielding cane better suited to Indian ground, and a deeper understanding of where the crop had come from in the first place. Most Indians will never know her name. Almost all of them have tasted her work. But here is the part that stings, because a triumph like that should have been met with open arms, and it was not. Being a woman in that laboratory, and a woman from her background, meant her findings were doubted and belittled, and in her own bitter words in a letter to a friend, she felt she was facing something close to persecution in an atmosphere she called pseudo-scientific. So she did what she would do more than once in her life when a door was slammed. She left. She went to England, first to a research institute outside London, where she found a colleague who took her seriously and poured her extraordinary knowledge of plant chromosomes into a monumental reference work still used by breeders today. And in 1946, the Royal Horticultural Society, the grand old institution of British gardening, hired her to work at its garden at Wisley, where she became the first woman scientist it had ever employed. Botanists were sent from as far away as Australia to study under her. The woman told at home that her work was not worth publishing had become, in an English royal garden, someone others crossed the world to learn from. And then, in 1951, the Prime Minister of a newly independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, asked her to come home and rebuild the country's botanical survey, its great effort to catalogue the plants of the entire nation. She returned, carrying a conviction that everything she had lived through had hardened into certainty, that India's plants should be studied by Indians and kept in India, not shipped abroad, as though the country could not be trusted with its own living heritage. And it was in those later years back on Indian soil that the deepest change in her came. She had spent her early career making plants more useful to people. Now she began to see, with growing alarm, what people were doing to plants. She watched India's forests falling to clear ground for farms and dams and development, and it distressed her to the core. She once described traveling many miles in search of the last known tree of a particular wild species, only to arrive and find it had already been burned to the ground. She was a scientist who had spent 60 years learning to read the living world at the level of the cell, and she could see, more clearly than the planners could, that some of what was being erased could never be written again. Which brings us back to Silent Valley. Now I want to be careful here about why this particular forest mattered so much, because it is the heart of everything. Silent Valley was not just any patch of green. It was one of the last large stretches of undisturbed tropical evergreen rainforest left anywhere in India, a place that had been evolving on its own, without human interference, for an immense span of time. Within it grew close to 1,000 species of flowering plants, along with rare orchids found in few other places, and it sheltered animals that exist almost nowhere else on Earth. Among them, the lion-tailed macaque, a striking, endangered monkey with a silver mane, whose whole world is the high canopy of forests exactly like this one. There were species here that had never been properly studied, and relationships between plant and insect and animal that had been quietly running for longer than there had been cities anywhere on Earth. To a botanist, a place like this is not scenery. It is data and memory and mystery all at once, most of it never yet even read. A forest like that is not a thing you can replant. It is the accumulated work of millions of years, every species a line in a book that was written slowly and can never be rewritten. And that is precisely what the hydroelectric project threatened to drown. When Janaki Amal understood what was being planned, she did what she had done her whole life. She refused to accept that it was inevitable. By now, she was around 80 years old, but she used the one thing a lifetime of work had given her, her scientific reputation, to argue that this forest was worth more standing than flooded. And she made a proposal that was pure Janaki Amal, the instinct of a scientist to the last. She urged that a careful chromosome survey be carried out of the valley's trees and plants, a detailed record of the genetic makeup of the forest, so that if nothing else, the world would at least know what it held before deciding whether to destroy it. Study it, she was in effect saying, while it is still alive to be studied. But, and this matters enormously, she was not the campaign, and it would be wrong to tell you she was. The fight to save Silent Valley became one of the great environmental movements in India's history, and it drew in a whole society. Scientists and naturalists lent their expertise. Poets wrote in the forest's defense, and their words became rallying cries. Teachers, students, activists, and a grassroots people's science movement carried the argument to the public, and ordinary citizens who would never see the valley themselves came to care whether it lived or died. This was, in many ways, one of the first great environmental battles of independent India, an early test of whether a developing country in a desperate hurry could still decide that some things were worth more left alone. It grew into a national conversation about what a country owes to the last wild places inside it, and in the end, that pressure reached the very top, and the national government stepped in, and the project was abandoned. The dam was never built. The valley was never flooded. Here, though, is the bittersweet turn this story takes, the part that stays with me. Janaki Amal did not live to see the ending she had fought for. She died in February of 1984, and it was later that same year, on the 15th of November 1984, months after her death, that Silent Valley was formally declared a national park, its forest protected at last, for good. She had spent some of the final energy of a long life defending a place she would never see made safe. She trusted the outcome to a future she would not be part of. There is a particular kind of courage in that. In spending yourself on something you already know you will not live to see finished, planting, in effect, a tree whose shade will only ever fall on someone else. And now, step back and look at what actually survived because of that fight. Because this is the astonishing part, and it is not some single magical plant or miraculous transformation. It is something quieter and far larger. An entire ancient ecosystem is still there. Walk into Silent Valley today, and the mist still hangs in the canopy. The rain still drips from those enormous old trees, the orchids still cling to the bark, the insects still move through the undergrowth, and the lion-tailed macaques still slip through the high branches exactly as they did before anyone ever drew a dam across a map. Close to 1,000 species of flowering plants still grow where a reservoir was supposed to be. The whole living archive is intact, still being read, still writing itself, when by every reasonable expectation it should be lying silent under 100 feet of water. That is what survived, not a specimen, a world. And that, in the end, is the lesson I keep coming back to with Janaki Amal, and it is the thing she seemed to grasp more deeply than the people with the blueprints. We have a habit of looking at a forest and seeing empty land, unused space, a resource waiting to be put to work. She looked at a forest and saw the opposite. She saw a living archive, an irreplaceable record of life assembled over unimaginable stretches of time, where every orchid and every insect and every ancient tree is a page that took the world millions of years to write, and that no power station, no budget, and no act of will can ever restore once it is gone. You can always build another dam. You cannot build another Silent Valley. If this changed the way you think about what we lose when we lose a forest, let me know in the comments and tell me whether you believe places like this should be protected outright, no matter the cost in power or profit, or whether that is a harder line than the real world allows. If it moved you, share it with someone who ought to know her name, and subscribe because there are more of these forgotten stories than you would ever guess, and I have got plenty more to tell you. I'm Harold Calder. Thanks for watching.